Joining us now live from London, UK, senior correspondent with InsideArabia.com, Sami Hamdi. It's always good to have him on. Haven't had him on in a few weeks, so it's good to have him back. Sami, thanks for being with us today.
Thanks for having me, John.
Oh, it's always good to have you on, man. Hey, I want to talk about a recent piece that you just did on Libya's ceasefire prospects amidst protests and foreign interference. You know, this Libya situation, a lot of people in the U.S. now have tuned out because of the election. This is why I have you guys on, because there's other things going in the world other than Biden and Trump. And the Libyan situation, out of control. Obviously, you had the bombing going on there, the explosion. You've got the Haftar situation. You've got Turkey involved. Give us an update. Where are we now on Libya? What is going on there?
So for the first time in Libya's conflict, you now have a balance of power in terms of the military dynamic. So because Turkey is now supporting the internationally recognized government, which before Turkish intervention was a very impotent force on the ground, there's now been a balance of power. Russia and Egypt and the UAE and France on one side, Turkey, Qatar on the other side, and the US just watching to see who the eventual winner is going to be. So because of the stakes are very high now as a result of this balance of power, the international power brokers, Turkey, Russia, Germany, and Egypt, they sat together and they said, look, the price is a bit too high to continue fighting. Why don't we come to some sort of agreement with regards to a ceasefire? And the interesting thing is that despite the fact that you have these two blocs who are competing with one another, these two international blocs, for the first time their interests have actually started to align. So, for example, let's start with Turkey. Turkey in the West now has control of some key military bases. It's now building a naval base in Misrata, which is on the coastline of the Mediterranean, which will allow it to project its power on the Mediterranean. Russia has been able to bypass the US, which to be honest, has not had a clear policy at all and has not indicated at all what it wants in Libya. Russia's been able to bypass the US and exert itself, and it secured the key military base in the south called Al Jufra and seized control of some of the key oil facilities. In terms of Egypt, they just want the war to finish because they've got a headache with regards to Sudan and with regards to Ethiopia over the Renaissance Dam. They've also got the problem with the East Mediterranean. There's a lot of tension there, talk of war that might take place over there. So Egypt wants Libya to end so it can focus on more important issues. So all of these interests aligned together to bring about this ceasefire. You'll note that I haven't mentioned the Libyans here because the Libyans are not in the driving seat. They're not the ones who decide whether there should be a ceasefire or not. The matter has always been one of international powers because both sides, the internationally recognized government and Haftar in the east, their power comes from international support. It does not come from domestic popularity. Both sides are resented by their respective Libyan citizens who live in each of their territories. And that's why it's ironic that despite this ceasefire, we now see protests emerging in the east and the west. It's not just in Tripoli, it's also in Haftar's territory where the people are saying, listen, you elites have fought this war for a long time now, for 8 years, all because you guys are fighting for your seats, you're fighting for power, whereas we are the ones suffering the blackout, suffering the different, various different tragedies, whether it's civilian casualties, whether it's not lack of access to food and basic essentials. So that's in a nutshell where Libya is moving. The problem now is that there's no clear passage or no clear view as to where do we go from here. Who will look after the negotiations? What kind of terms will be discussed? Can we do elections like the way that Egypt suggested? We do some elections in the east, some elections in the west, and then they appoint a president between themselves. The U.S. is mired in its own domestic situation, which you know better than I do. Trump, Biden, nobody's clear over who's going to win in the upcoming elections. The U.S. is concerned with its own internal issues and is essentially saying with regards to Libya, listen, at the end of the day, the winner's going to come to Washington anyway. So when you guys figure it out, let us know, and then we'll get involved. So that's it in a nutshell.
So basically the U.S., because of the situation, the political situation, we're sitting this one out, the Trump administration not getting directly involved, weighing in one side or the other, is what you're saying. We're with Sami Hamdi live from London. Sami, senior correspondent with Inside Arabia. Go to InsideArabia.com. I've been telling you for a long time, folks, as goes the Middle East, goes everything else. You want the best news and information, go to InsideArabia.com, based in Washington, D.C. Sami, a couple questions here. Let's get to ex-General Haftar, his Libyan National Army. Where is he in this now? I mean, he was gaining control. There was a time there where it looked like he was might be in a position to actually take over. Where is he now? What's going on with that now?
So Haftar had his chance to essentially establish control over all of Libya when he was attacking Tripoli, the capital. So essentially he had an implied green light from Washington, from Paris, who basically said, listen, we're not going to get involved. If you can bring about a quick resolution to this offensive and unite Libya, then we're happy to recognize you, but just find a way to end this war. So they allowed, but Haftar failed in the offensive. Haftar was unable to take over Tripoli, and the Turks came in. They drove him all the way back to Sirte, which is bang in the middle of Libya. So essentially, because of his spectacular failure, all of the international parties that were supporting him essentially went back to the table and said, listen, we need to find an alternative. Haftar is no longer, we can no longer continue to support Haftar. He doesn't listen to us too much, so let's find an alternative. So they started to support a rival of Haftar called Aguila Saleh, who is the political face, who is the Speaker of the Parliament in the East. And instead of Haftar going to Moscow, going to Paris, going to these different capitals as the diplomatic face, Aguila Saleh became the person who became the diplomatic face, which was a clear sidelining of Haftar. And Egypt also made clear to Haftar that there's going to be a few changes and that he has to accept it. Haftar, of course, is not happy because Haftar's relevance is contingent on a continuation of the war. Haftar is only as relevant as long as the war continues to go on, because he offers that military solution. But if there's a political process that requires liaising, cooperation between the various parties, and it gives space for his rivals in the East to start emerging, visiting Cairo themselves and Moscow and the like. So the problem for Haftar now is if he breaks the ceasefire, then he angers Egypt and Russia. And if he doesn't break the ceasefire, then Egypt and Russia are already sidelining him and empowering his rivals. So he's in a very, very awkward situation.
So what does he do?
So essentially, the U.S. sent a delegation to see Haftar, essentially to, not necessarily to tell him don't worry about it, but as in to say to him, look, listen, this is how we see it going forward. It's going to be a negotiated transition. We're going to try to negotiate between the various different parties. And essentially, you failed in your Tripoli offensive, so we need to see where we go from here. Haftar, the reality is that he's not entirely sure what he's supposed to do. For Haftar, what is working in his favor, and the reason he's quiet, and the reason why he hasn't broken the ceasefire, is because of the protests that are in Tripoli. It's like a gift from heaven for Haftar. Essentially, Haftar is the reason the Tripoli, there are protests in Tripoli. One of the main reasons is they're complaining about energy cuts. The reason why there are energy cuts, energy outages, is because Haftar is preventing oil from being exported. So the proceeds of the oil are not going to Tripoli. So they don't have the money to maintain the energy requirements of Tripoli. So Haftar is suddenly realizing that, wait, I don't need to actually go back to war. If I'm just patient and I wait for these protests to bring down the government, and I exacerbate these protests by continuing my oil blockade, then it may well be that when the government falls and the militias in the West start fighting each other once more and they stop being united, then I can launch another military offensive and sweep up afterwards. So this is, I think, the gamble that Haftar is waiting for.
Sami Hamdi with us. Excellent analysis. Inside Arabia. Go to InsideArabia.com on the Libyan situation. Sami, thank you for that. I want to get to now Hamas. Where does Hamas fit in this? And then I'm going to get to Erdogan and the stunning expansion of Turkey's influence in this region that just popped up under the radar screen. And now everywhere you turn, Turkey and Erdogan are involved in something in a very significant way. But let's get to Hamas. Hamas has elected officials in the government. They've been very successful there. Where are they all in everything?
I think with Hamas in terms of the Palestine-Israel issue, generally, Hamas is we have to remember that it was elected in 2006 in a landslide election by the Palestinian people, and the world said we're not ready to recognize Hamas. And I think what people struggle to understand with regards to the Israel-Palestine issue is that whilst many in the US can empathize with Israel, they lack the ability to empathize with the Palestinians. And I always argue that the American spirit, this idea of rugged individualism and this idea of carving out a sense of the American dream, actually lies more with the Palestinians than it does with the Israelis. Because when you think about it, if any American had his land taken or seized by a different power, then it would be in the American spirit to fight until that land is taken back. I think with regards to Hamas, Hamas is isolated. Hamas is under significant pressure as a result of the UAE and Israel coming along with normalization of ties. Hamas has tried, they met with Erdogan, I think, last week, some of their leaders, to try to discuss moving forward in terms of trying to find some sort of support for Gaza with regards to its electricity needs, its food needs, trying to lift some of the blockade that Israel is implementing. But I think with regards to Hamas, there's news today that they're going to meet with their rivals, which is not unprecedented, but definitely an unusual step, which suggests that this normalization of ties between the UAE and Israel may finally unite the Palestinian factions in a manner in which they might genuinely be able to leverage against Israel and actually be able to push Israel to sit seriously at the negotiation table and actually concede some of the terms that Israel until now has never thought of doing so.
Sami, Hamdi, you're saying that that's a result of the normalization, the public normalization of relations between the UAE and Israel, that it's going to bring the Israelis to the negotiating table. Is that my understanding?
It's in an inadvertent way. Basically, the UAE have stabbed the Palestinians in the back, and Netanyahu, despite the normalization, actually humiliated the UAE. So the UAE thought that if we normalize ties with Israel, then we'll get F-35s from the US, we'll be considered an equal partner to Israel, an equal partner to the US, and will be treated accordingly. But Netanyahu humiliated the UAE by reneging on the agreement to pressure the Palestinians. So the UAE said, listen, we've done this agreement, and Netanyahu will stop pressuring the Palestinians. Netanyahu immediately went to war with Gaza. Not only that, Netanyahu came out and said that we don't want F-35s to be sold to the UAE. So when Pompeo went to the Middle East countries and said to them, guys, normalize ties with Israel, the countries got together and said, listen, UAE hasn't benefited anything. Netanyahu is walking all over the UAE, and he's not even giving them even a semblance of respect publicly. Why would we normalize ties? And that's why Netanyahu today is making a U-turn and suggesting he might agree and lobby the US to accept the sale of F-35s from the US to the UAE in Netanyahu realizing the mistake that he made by humiliating the UAE. In terms to Hamas, this unification of some of the Palestinian factions is because there is significant fears that the Arabs will normalize ties with Israel in what is going to be considered an ultimate betrayal of the cause. So the Palestinians believe that it's time now to unite as one body and fight for themselves with the support of the likes of Turkey and Qatar and the like, because they can no longer rely on the Arab nations. So when we're talking about negotiations and actually sitting negotiating seriously, it's about fighting Israel again and getting that unified power once more, so that to make Israel genuinely give concessions by virtue of the fact that if they don't, then they will genuinely suffer a war in which they might actually suffer casualties this time.
Such an in-depth insight analysis, Sami. I have to compliment you on the situation that is, again, in the U.S. going under the radar screen because we're all focused on the domestic election, the riots that we're having, the safety of people getting shot every day. So I really appreciate that. I've got 2 minutes. Bring Erdogan's Turkey into this. I mean, everywhere it pops up, all of a sudden, the new Turkish Empire with Erdogan is in the middle of something in a significant way. What is Erdogan's objective in Libya?
I think, to be honest, everything you're seeing from Erdogan, this expansion of Turkey that you're seeing, is as a result of the U.S. abandoning its relationship with Turkey. The U.S. ignored Turkey's demand. When the Syria war was developing and all those refugees pouring into Turkey and all of those terrorist groups operating on the border with Turkey, Erdogan spent 6 years going to Washington and back and telling them, guys, please, I need assistance here. I'm a NATO ally. I'm your friend. And the U.S. were essentially saying, listen, we're not interested. We're not ready to help you. You have to fix it yourself and go and solve it yourself. And in 2016, there was an attempted coup in Turkey, which, according to suggestions, the US would have been happy for it to succeed. So they alienated Erdogan so much that Erdogan now is pursuing a policy that will result in that he does not have to rely on the US anymore. In other words, it's a relationship where I wanted to be the US's friend. The US said, I'm not interested in you. So to survive, I need my own policy. And that's what we're seeing in Libya. That's what we're seeing in the Mediterranean. And I think that's what Washington policymakers have yet to appreciate. And I think the only policymaker who actually appreciates that is Gina Haspel, the head of the CIA and the head of the MI5 in the UK, the new appointee, Moore, who was the former ambassador to Turkey, who understand that Turkey has legitimate grievances. And I think that's why we see the US is not going fully on board with Europe against Erdogan in the East Mediterranean, in Libya, because Washington is in the state of flux. Like, we know that part of it is our fault. We don't want to completely alienate Erdogan now. We want to repair our relationship. But Erdogan is forcing us into a position where it looks like we're the ones bowing our heads and we don't want to bow our heads. In other words, it's like two very old friends who fell out because one took the relationship for granted, and now they can't find some way to come back together again. So I think in terms of Erdogan and finding some way to contain that Turkish expansion, it's in the U.S. hands, but not necessarily by force, but by reminding Erdogan that he's a valuable partner and Turkey is a valuable partner, and that's what the U.S. has not done yet.
Right. So under the Obama administration, when all this happened with the refugees, there was really no appreciation of us, of what he was going through. We offered no help as a NATO ally. Then in the Trump administration, the focus has been obviously on Israel and the annexation, moving the embassy, although Trump did side with Erdogan in Syria when he pulled the troops out and trusted Erdogan that there wouldn't be this massacre of Kurds at the time that everybody said there was going to be. But so there seems to be some movement, but really not enough. But look, I got to tell you, Sami, fabulous analysis. I really appreciate that. Sami Hamdi, senior contributor with InsideArabia.com. Go to InsideArabia.com. You got to read his piece. One of the best pieces you're going to find, Libya ceasefire prospects amid protests and foreign interference. And he kind of lays it all out in a fabulous analysis. Sami Hamdi, live from London. Go to InsideArabia.com. They're based in Washington, D.C. My number one choice for news and analysis coming out of the Middle East, the Gulf, and North Africa. Sami, thank you for that fabulous analysis, sir. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, John. Thank you. Have a good day.
It's always an honor to have you on. You're one of the best writers in the world.